I am excited about the series Spirituality versus Religion and all of the topics that have come up from that, because I was a person many years ago when I was an atheist that I just thought religion sounded awful. Like, I just had really bad experiences with religious people, and I mean, it's kind of funny that I'm a Christian, because I thought that, I would never even set foot in a church, let alone, have that change of life. But one of the things that changed my life is how different Jesus is than what I experienced of religious people. So even if, it was kind of like, even as an atheist, I think the things that I had heard about Jesus sounded kind of cool in a way. Like Jesus, I really think, no matter what spiritual background you come from, he's an awesome spiritual guru. Like, to just study how he lived and how he thought. And what's interesting, and we're going to get into this today when we dig into our topic, is he often got into, he got intense arguments, conflicts with religious leaders of the time. He was not a fan, necessarily, of many religious leaders because they weren't very spiritual. They were superficial. They were judgmental. They were shallow. They were empty. They were, he just was Jesus didn't have intense words too much. Jesus was loving, full of love, but the words he got into, which we're going to look at some of them today, were for the religious leaders. So our topic today, we've been looking at different elements of what, one thing that's spiritual and one thing that's religious. And today's topic is, there's a couple ways, I've got two titles. One is servant versus master. Like those two elements of what it is to be a servant versus a master. But then I was thinking, well, we don't really think in those terms. So then I thought, well, maybe butler versus baller, right? If you're not familiar with the term baller, it represents somebody that is powerful and has it all together and is wealthy, and it's just like, it's like you want to be a baller. Everybody, in this world, everybody kind of talks about, oh, you're such a baller. I want to be a baller. It's just sort of, as far as, that's the great ambition. And so we're going to compare those and see what Jesus had to say. But he used the term servant and master. So, anyway, let's look at Matthew 23 in verse 1. It says, Jesus spoke to the multitudes and his disciples, saying, the scribes and Pharisees, who are the religious leaders, sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But don't do according to their works, for they say and do not. And do not do. Now that's religious, isn't it? Haven't you experienced that as far as religious people? That they can preach up a game, but they don't do squat about it. Another thing of the emptiness of what we think of religion, or if you think religion's a good word, it would be more empty religion, if that communicates better for you. But it's the concept that matters. And in verse 4 it says, for they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. I mean, every time I read that, it kind of bothers me inside almost. Because this is truly, what was the guy? I wish I had remembered his name. I just came in from an overnight flight, so I didn't have a chance to look this up. But, I was thinking about the guy that was head of the World Christian Alliance for Churches, and he would be so angry about homosexuality, and then he's caught with a male prostitute. He's president over an organization that influences millions of people, and he's got all this anger and hatred. That's what we're talking about here. That's what Jesus was saying, is these people that put burdens and come up with all of this, laying, you could just even get a picture, of rules and things that you've got to live up to that buries you, that you can't, and that people live in shame and don't, that they think that they've got to go to God out of shame, and that they don't even do anything. Don't even lift a finger to do it. That's Jesus. Things haven't changed, from Jesus' day. It says, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. That's what Patty was talking about last week, where another element of religion is doing things because of what other people are going to see. It's about the outside presentation. It says they make their phylacteries broad. Well, what the heck is a phylactery? I'll tell you. But it's they make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. And those were elements of, their clothing that showed that they were the scribes and Pharisees. One of the phylacteries were basically something that carried the scriptures to say that they wore to kind of represent, the Word of God is close to my heart. But it was more for the show that they made them large so everybody could say, see, I'm holy. I'm down with God. Like, I'm all about God kind of thing. But it was for show. And then it says, in verse 6, they love the best places at the feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. So we see this as religious leaders that their drive for why they're doing it is for how people give them honor and glory, for titles. For the privilege that people go, you're a great, minister or something. Like, we'll give you the best seats. They like the power. They like the prestige Jesus is talking about. That's why they're doing it. And then in verse 11, Jesus, we're going to skip around a little bit because we've got a bunch of stuff to cover. It says, Jesus skips down in verse 11. He says, but he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. Jesus says greatness, real greatness, is having a heart to serve. That's what greatness is. God, it just makes me emotional thinking about it. I mean to tell you that there's nothing higher you can aspire to have a life of a servant. We're going to see that in the Word of God. And we're going to see that this impacts ministry, it impacts even jobs, work, everything. That was Jesus' perspective. And it says in verse 12, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Like, God will exalt you when you humble yourself. When you live a life of humility, God will lift you up. You live a life of arrogance, God will bring you down. It's and we have such a self-centered culture. Our culture is so oriented towards wanting to get the privilege, wanting to be favored. Selfies, my goodness. Our whole culture is selfie. Like, it's ridiculous. When did that get to be okay? It's just sort of like the idea of everybody wanting to prop themselves up. It's the opposite of spiritual. A lot of times too in ministry in particular, people, it's sad to me that, and I was introduced to a church. In the beginning, I was just all about Jesus and didn't really realize that there's politics in churches sometimes that can be kind of crummy. And so I was just about Jesus, I love Jesus, and it was great. And it wasn't until a little while, maybe a couple years into an organization, that I started becoming aware that it was a power thing to be a leader in the church. That it was like an ambition kind of a thing. And I just sort of, and the people did it for the wrong reasons. One of the reasons is the church, we're kind of fanatical about having our culture of our leadership be that our leaders understand the heart of serving, that that's what lives inside of their being. Nobody graduates to the place that they can't pick up a toilet brush and clean a toilet. It's just sort of like, if you think somehow in a position kind of mentality that you've just graduated beyond serving, or it's off. Your heart's just not the right place. And so that's even in we have a leadership training program called the Ambassador Program, and a big part of it is having our leaders trained to have a heart to serve. And I feel very good about that. I really feel like we have a leadership team that has gone to great lengths, that they are not about the glory. Like that they just care about people and are driven because of the love. Because of the love Jesus had for them, that they just want to serve and do anything to be able to make an impact and change lives. Let's go to Mark chapter 10. And here's another one that I just think is hilarious. Some of the Bible is hilarious to me. I just like, it's in Mark 10 and verse 32. Okay, Jesus this is like, well, I'll just read it and then we'll talk. It says, now they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was going before them, and they were amazed. And as they followed, they were afraid. Then he took the 12 aside again and began to tell them the things that would happen to him. And so he tells them, it says in verse 33, behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him. And the third day he will rise again. So he's laying heavy stuff on them. And could you imagine what it was like right then for Jesus? These are his closest friends, the people that he loves the most. He's like, not the most, but like his inner circle, people that he's like with all the time, that know him and that, and spend the most time with him. And he's sharing with them that he understands that he's about to get crucified, and he's telling them, like, imagine what it would be like to prepare mentally for that, to be executed. And to not only, and also to know the suffering that you're going through, what it would be like. So he's sharing that with them. Heavy stuff, right? So here's the funny part coming. Their reaction to this is kind of out of touch. In verse 35, then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. That's the reaction. Can you imagine? He's saying, hey guys, I just want to tell you what I'm going to go through. We want you to be prepared. He's like, we want you to do whatever we ask you to do. Like, now I'm sitting there thinking, if I was Jesus, do you what would you want to say? Are you kidding? Who do you think you are? Do you not know who I am? I mean, wouldn't that piss you off? You know what I'm saying? Just go. The gall, right? Do I look like a genie in a bottle? I'm Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah. I am not rub on the lamp and, But they're basically saying that. We want you to do, it kind of reminds me of children. Children do that to parents, right? I want you to do whatever I ask, It's just sort of, without even saying what it is. It's just sort of funny because Jesus is so loving. Because I would smack him upside the head or something. I don't have this kind of grace for that. But it was just, he says to them, in verse 36, he said to them, well, what do you want me to do for you? He's like, okay, let's hear what this is. What do you got? And so, here's their desire. He says in verse 37, they said to him, grant us that we may sit, one on your right side and the other on your left, in your glory. So one thing to understand is the concept in these times in the East, in biblical customs, is when somebody sat on your right hand, it was the second and number one man. It's just sort of it's your right. You've heard the term right-hand man. This was a position, though, of power and authority and glory. So here they're thinking, they have this picture of Jesus in the kingdom. They're thinking it's kind of like a worldly kingdom, he's just going to rule Jerusalem and the world and make Israel rise to some big powerful nation or something. And so they're saying, we want the top two spots next to you when you're in your glory and take over the world. When you take over the world, we'd like to be number one and number two next to you. That's their request. So then Jesus talks to them and says, we're not going to read that part, but you can read it. It's kind of funny. He said, I don't think you can, take the cup, like being crucified. They go, yes, we can. They don't even know what they're talking about. But anyway. But then basically we're going to skip back because here's the lesson in verse 42. Jesus called them to himself and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to be great among you shall be what? Your servant. In verse 44, and whoever of you desires to be first shall be what? Slave of all. In verse 45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. That's just huge. I mean, just look at that. His lesson out of this, when they're vying for position and power, they want to be ballers, right? He's saying, that's, your values are off. He said, and he even uses, it's kind of interesting because he's using the world like example of how they do it in the world and in business. And so he's saying the Gentiles, their idea of power and being first is power, like lording it over you. Like if you get in a position of power, and a lot of times isn't that why people want to be successful? You want everybody to kiss your butt? Do you know what I mean? Like, I want everybody to like me, I want everybody to like, I want the influence, I want like the favors, I want the privileges, or whatever. And so he's saying that's how it works in the world. He said, but that's not how it should be with you. He's like, and those are strong language. It says, if you desire to be great, you need to be a servant. The greatness, to think about, if you want great things for you. And I believe that this applies even in business. I was just reading David Ramsey's book, he's kind of a big financial guru, and I'm sure he's worth many millions of dollars, powerful guy. And he was saying, and I was just like, I could so relate to this, that in business, the way he thinks is everything is still about how can you serve people. That's still the heart. I think about that for my business. I'm a business owner, and it's a challenge for me because I'm like a volunteer as a pastor, and then I'm running a business, and it's hard because like time, how do I spend it? And it matters to me because the people that I'm serving in my business, I still want them to feel served and cared about. And yet I've got a limited bandwidth. There's only so much I can do. But I pray every day to ask God to say, God, show me how I can be a servant in this role. With the limited resources that I have, how can I best show up and be a servant? And this works for no matter what we do. And Dave Ramsey was interesting because he was talking about how a lot of people like focus on ambition or success or money, and that's their goal. But usually those things, success follows when you have a heart to serve, that's where you're at. So we can look at it whether it's a spiritual perspective or even from the worldly perspective. But then, in verse 44 it says, he who desires to be first shall be slave. That's even a stronger language of slave and thinking about what? Like slave is just like, anybody like that idea of being a slave? Does that ever sound appealing? It's specifically the word slave here is the way that they, in the Old Testament there was a type of slavery where people couldn't take care of themselves as well, and they actually went to their master and said, you take really good care of me, and I will choose to serve you for life. And that person was a bond slave for life. But it was willing because that person signed up for it. They said, you are a good master and take good care of me. I will be your bond servant for life. And that's what it's talking about is the concept of of saying, yes, I will serve you willingly. But it's still kind of, the word slave is pretty intense. And then it says, Jesus. It said, did not come. Jesus, the only begotten Son of God, the Messiah, he did not come to be served, but to serve. If anybody you think would deserve to be served, it would be Jesus, right? That to me blows my mind. So why would we aspire for anything different? Do you know what I'm saying? It's the highest thing you can aspire to. It's a mindset, though. Let's go to one more. In John chapter 13. It says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, in verse 4, rose from supper, and he laid aside his garments, and took a towel and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. And then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? And so I want to kind of tell you a little bit about this, because Lachey was talking about how she didn't like feet, kind of dirty and stuff, like feet. So I don't know. I don't think it sounds that bad to me right now to wash feet. It doesn't sound like the worst possible thing. But it's not exactly a grandiose kind of a job. But in biblical times, as Lachey was pointing out, feet were dirtier. They didn't have pavement, It was dirt. It was like people walked around with dirt. They didn't bathe as often, just sort of it was just another time. They didn't have all the luxuries and the modern things that we have. So those feet were really crummy. Somebody's feet were just about... Do you know what it makes me think of? If Jesus showed up at your house with a toilet brush and said, I am here to wash your toilets today. Do you know what? Because we don't wash feet today, it would have that same symbolism, because it was kind of the lowest job. It was the most subservient job to wash somebody's feet like that. So what would that be like? What would it feel like if Jesus showed up like that and said, I'm here to scrub your toilets today? If that's the message. Wouldn't you think that's kind of a lower kind of a job? But again, you see Jesus and his heart of a servant. So, in verse 6 it says, when he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, you are washing my feet. So, Peter was kind of shocked by this, understandably. In verse 7, Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. And Jesus teaches a few things about this feet washing later. We're just going to focus on one. And then Peter in verse 8 said to him, you shall never wash my feet. That's terrible, Lord. No, don't wash my feet. Wouldn't you feel that way if Jesus came and said, I'll wash your toilets? No, Jesus, no. So it's just sort of understandable. It's kind of cool in some ways, because you're going, wow, you get that Peter understands to have reverence for the Lord, that's his heart. You go, oh, that's cool that he's relating to the Lord that way. But on the other hand, he's not listening to the Lord. He's like, okay, if that's really your Lord, you'd be kind of wanting to listen, right, to what he's saying to you. So it says, and Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Because he's talking about the symbolism of the cleansing as well. And then verse 9, Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but my hands and my head. Give me a bath, Lord. Give me a bath then. If that's what you say. So you see, it's kind of cool, Peter's eagerness there, but Peter's a trip sometimes. And in verse 12, it says, so I'm going to focus on this part of the lesson. It says, so when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord. You say, well, for so I am. He's not saying, oh, no, I'm not teacher, I'm not Lord. He's like, yes, I am here. Because that's a part of serving as well. Being a teacher is a part of serving. And sometimes the truth is, that is what we're called, where that's how we can best serve somebody. That's a part of it. So he's saying, that is true about me. He said, but If I, then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. So, you just see, like, Jesus, the priority he put on serving was a big deal. He's saying, if I am your Lord and do this, that the goal is that we want to have a mindset to serve one another. Like that's where we want to live, that's what's in our heart. And we can't be everywhere. So part of it is just sort of like that we want to live a lifestyle of serving, as well as just saying, God, I'll serve wherever you need me to be. I want to serve wherever the greatest need is. You know, it's not, like I said, we used to get, because we're a new church, we just, started like a year ago. And because we're new, we get a lot of people show up. You know, it's one of the things I've talked to my pastor network, where it's kind of commonplace, where people come along and everybody wants to be in leadership. People show up brand new and they go, oh, I'm a leader. And everybody tells me I'm a leader. And I've been very acknowledged by many other churches, and they always exalt me right away to leadership. And you're just like, oh, well, the way we do things here is people get out a broom. You know, I just like we just have a mindset that no matter where you're at, if you want a healthy organization where it's just like wherever you're at, you don't mind picking up a broom, or setting the chair, it's just sort of like, there's no like you skip over that and now you're all high and mighty, because it's your heart's wrong. Do you get it? It's just sort of like, you just want to be where it's not about that. It's not about the glory. It's just about, God, where do you call me to be? And God says, faithful in little, faithful in much, that as we are faithful in the things of just wanting to show up and serve and fill a need, that's what Jesus said. He who humbles himself, God's going to exalt them. You're given things because God says, I can trust your heart, that it's not about the glory, that you do care, that it's about serving, that it's about people, and that that's what's driving you. So you can do this in ministry, you can do this at work. Does that, it's kind of a cool picture. So I'm going to do a little meditation as we close out, if you guys want to close your eyes. And I just want you to think right now. It's always good to sort of think about what God might be stirring in your heart about this. And I just want you to think right now as far as what comes up. What comes up in areas that maybe, if there are areas, maybe that there's been an attachment to, to wanting to be, to ambition that's not coming from a place of serving. Or areas that you want to have more of a servant heart in your life, whether it's in ministry or at work or with friends or just being there. Because every single one of us, God says, that has given us gifts, one-of-a-kind gifts to serve and to make a difference.